and welcome everyone to this webinar on navigating Scope 3 with a special guest from BlueScope's Steel, Devinka Piyasena. My name is Katharina Bauch. I'm head of carbon here at ThinkStep, and I had the pleasure of working with Devinka and the team at BlueScope for a few years now, supporting them on their Scope 3 reporting journey. And I'm really delighted to have Devinka here with us today to share her and BlueScope's experience with greenhouse gas reporting and how they tackle their Scope 3 emissions. Let me formally introduce you to Devinka. Devinka is BlueScope's Climate Change Manager. She works on BlueScope's climate strategy, climate risk, governance and disclosures. With a focus on Scope 3, Devinka oversees BlueScope's reporting process and led the development of a long-term work program aimed to improve the accuracy of Scope 3 emissions and identify emission reduction opportunities. So probably great to hear, as a lot of you identified the lack of data as a problem here and the accuracy of data. So probably something to learn here. Before I hand over to Devinka, I thought I would start with a quick recap of what Scope 3 emissions are, why they might be challenging to define and address, and why they're probably still quite important for most companies. So the emissions that we want to capture in our reporting are really all the emissions from your operations and your value chain. So all the activities that add together to the value of your product or your service. And so you have your Scope 1 emissions here. These are the direct emission sources from facilities or vehicles you control, for example, the fuel in your trucks. Then we have the Scope 2 emissions that sit a little bit in between. They're indirect emissions, mainly related to electricity or steam heating, cooling that you buy in. And then we have Scope 3, which means under Scope 3, then is everything that's covered that's not under Scope 1 and Scope 2. So really looking at your entire value chain. You quite often see them reported in those 15 categories that you see on my screen right now. So that's based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I won't go into detail of each of them, but I will touch base on a few while discussing one question that we get asked quite often, and that is there not any double counting between companies, double counting of emissions when we are looking at our entire value chain? And the answer to that is yes, there is double counting, and it's a purposeful double counting. So the aim of looking at Scope 3 is really to encourage and facilitate collaboration and have entities taking action simultaneously to reduce emissions. So several entities tackling the same emissions in your supply chain, in your country, or even for our entire society. So an example for that purposeful double counting could be transportation. So if your company produces a product, it needs to be transported to your customers. That's usually happened by a third party, a logistic provider. So that's your Scope 3, the outgoing transport. For your customer, it's incoming transport as well, Scope 3. And then for the logistics provider itself, it falls under their Scope 1 because it's the trucks that they own and the fuel that they burn within those trucks. And so an ideal action when you start looking at your Scope 3 emissions is really to map out your supply chain, map out your key stakeholders, and start reaching out to them, such as your customers, suppliers, investors, or regulators. And the aim in the first instance is really to understand where are they in regard to GHG reporting. Is this something they care about? Is this something they have already started? Is that important to them? Do they need to report themselves under mandatory requirements? And so it might help you starting the discussion with your customers early to see where can you add value to them beyond your product. So you could support their data collection, or maybe there is some space for additional collaboration. Talking to your suppliers, you might learn that they're already doing something that's quite useful for you that you could utilize. Or if they haven't heard about emissions or scopes and don't know what that is, it's quite good for you to realize that early and take them with you on the path. And that leads me to my last point, the benefit of looking at your emissions, in particular Scope 3. So there might be options for new market opportunities, some low carbon options for interested customers. If you authentically communicate the actions you're taking, you can enhance your brand, keep your employees, winning new employees, and build these strong relationships by adding additional value to your customers. It might improve your access to finance. So there might be low interest rates that you can access for low carbon developments. It will also help you to identify and mitigate potential greenhouse gas related risks due to regulatory changes or market shifts to low carbon solutions. So while you might not fall under some of the thresholds for mandatory reporting, if 80% of your customers do, there might be some trickle down effect that then will affect you. With that, I will hand over to Devinka, who will tell you more about BlueScope's GHG reporting journey and their process approach to tackle Scope 3 and some of the challenges they encountered. Over to you, Devinka.
Thank you, Katrina. I hope you can see my screen. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to extend this acknowledgement to any other traditional owners joining this webinar from around the world and pay my respects to them. So kicking things off, a little bit about BlueScope. So we're a steel manufacturer and a leader in metal coating and painting for the building and construction sector. So our global operating footprint, you can see on our slide, we have over 160 sites in 15 countries. Essentially, this means that our Scope 3 profile is quite unique given the complexity of our value chain. And as we have operations across multiple parts of the steel value chain, this becomes a lot more complex to manage from a data reporting point of view. So for example, we make steel in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. We then have midstream operations where we coat and paint the steel. And then we also have downstream operations where we make products for specific uses. So things like roofing, structural steel, buildings, and componentry. And from a Scope 3 perspective, if you think about it, the raw materials we use for each of these different operations is very different. So for example, the raw material we use to make the steel include things like iron ore, coal, scrap steel, alloys, and additives, among others. For our midstream sites, the raw materials include paint, resins, coating metals like zinc and aluminium. And then for our downstream businesses, we sometimes use our own steel, but we also buy steel externally to make those componentries that I mentioned. So as a result of our global operations, we do have a large supplier base, and it's quite complex given the regional diversity that we have. So with that in mind, a little bit about our Scope 3 data itself. So we've started reporting Scope 3 emissions back in 2020. So we're still pretty early in our reporting journey. In terms of the emission footprint itself, Scope 3 emissions cover just over half of our overall Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And as you can see on the chart on screen, the proportions haven't changed much over the last 5 years. And from a specific volume point of view, our Scope 3 emissions for last year, so FY24, was 12.3 million tonnes. From a Scope 3 breakdown point of view, which is at the bottom of the slide, we present this slightly differently because this is what's most important to us. But if you wanted to see how this breaks down against the 15 categories of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you can find that detail in our data supplement. In terms of the actual numbers itself, nearly 85% of our Scope 3 emissions come from just 3 categories. So the first one is purchased goods and services, which is highlighted in the slide now, which accounts for 60% of our emissions. So that's the largest contributor. And then we also have the downstream processing and use of our sold products, which contribute to those top 3 categories, which are in green and orange on the slide. A bit more context around the work we've been doing on Scope 3. So in the last 12 to 18 months, we developed a long-term pathway and work program on Scope 3, where we really wanted to focus our efforts on 3 areas. The first was improving the quality and accuracy of our data, so ensuring that our data is representative of our value chain from a completeness point of view. And this also meant that we needed to look at updating any underlying assumptions or estimates around our data, as well as looking to kind of move from industry averages to supply-specific details when estimating emissions. I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges organizations face when it comes to Scope 3, and it certainly has been a challenge for us as well. The second focus area is around value chain engagement. So it's really about identifying opportunities to reduce Scope 3 emissions by working with our suppliers and our customers. And then the last one's around determining the value proposition of our products to empower our customers to make more informed decisions. You can find more detail about the work we've been doing across all of these areas in our second climate action report, which is available on our website. But really the focus for this webinar I want to look at is really that first bucket, which is around accurate data. So our reporting journey, as I mentioned before, we started reporting Scope 3 5 years ago, and we've been making incremental improvements to our data over the last few years. I won't necessarily go into detail on each one, as I will cover it in the next section, but I wanted to do a couple of call outs. So when we initially did this work, we got thinkstep to come in to map our value chain, look at the key activities that were important across that value chain, and then determine the relevant sources of Scope 3 emissions. We started to look at what's the best way we could kind of gather the data based on the resourcing and the capabilities we had across our team and thinkstep. So we really looked at, firstly, what was most material to our business? Do we actually have existing sources of information that we could tap into to gather the first round of data? And as you can imagine, we started with industry-specific emission factors to estimate emissions when we started 5 years ago. And there was a lot of assumptions that underpinned all the other emission categories in our inventory as well. I guess a key thing to note is that when you start your reporting, you're not going to have everything you need. All those extra bells and whistles you want to add into it, you need to consider to build that over time. And that's kind of what we've been doing over the last few years. And in terms of those improvements, I think we've made a lot of headway in the last 2 to 3 years. So one of the things we did was to have a bit of a concerted effort to try and capture more supplier-specific information in our reporting, and also look at refining any underlying assumptions or estimates on some of the more material categories for our business. And these improvements are really based on materiality, really looking at what's most important to us, where the gaps in understanding are, and looking to improve the accuracy of our data, which was a key priority for us. And I will talk through some examples here. So the 3 things I wanted to focus on was firstly looking at the work we did to expand the reporting of complex categories, and also revising assumptions around some of the other categories we started off with. So in 2023, we broadened the coverage of our category 10 emissions to include emissions from the processing of coal products that were sold to downstream customers. So what I mean by that is these were coal products, things like waste products like slag, coal tar, that was generated out of our steelmaking operations that were then used by downstream industries such as cement manufacturing or others. So the process we followed was we firstly mapped out the end use of these coal products. We then identified key members across our business unit who would be able to tell us a bit more about who the customers were that were buying these coal products and what they then used this for. So it was a combination of kind of, looking at their website, the customer websites, or the knowledge our business unit members had around what those coal products were then used for. We then worked with thinkstep to map out the appropriate emission factors to estimate emissions. And then we also got all the relevant sales volumes from our internal teams to be able to calculate these emissions. Similarly, last year, we also looked at updating the underlying assumptions related to the upstream and downstream transportation of our raw material and finished products. So specifically, we looked at the mode of transport, so whether it's marine, road, rail, and then the associated transport routes that were taken for some of our key raw materials and finished products. And we used actual data to then revise our emissions. And the last thing was around purchased steel. So as I mentioned previously, in the areas where we don't make the steel ourselves, we do externally purchase steel, and it's the largest source of emissions for goods and services category. And there were some assumptions that when you initially did the work, we looked at looking at the manufacturing route of our steel, and we assumed that they came out of blast furnaces, which is a primary form of steel making. And over the years, we've been working with our procurement team to get more granular detail on the actual manufacturing route of this steel to be able to then refine our emissions that we estimate. From a supplier-specific emission factor point of view, as I mentioned previously, we made a concerted effort to get more granular detail in the last 2 years. So in terms of the process, it was really important to onboard and train our procurement team, as they will be the ones who will be going out to really engage with our suppliers. So as part of the training, what we really did was make sure the procurement team knew what they were asking for. So supplier emission factors can be varied for different suppliers based on how their operations are set up. For example, do they make single products? Do they make multiple products? Do they buy materials to manufacture the products they sell to you? The upstream emission footprint of an iron ore supply will be very different to one of paint supply. So it was really important that we understood what we were asking for. And we worked closely with ThinkStep to run a few education sessions for our procurement team to explain what we meant by this and ensure that they asked for the right information in return. In terms of the supplier engagement approach, what we learned was that it's really important to note that one size doesn't fit all. The engagement approach is really dependent on your suppliers, where they are on their reporting journeys and how open they are to engage with you. So the first thing we did was we looked at whether the information we needed was already publicly available, whether it was through sustainability reports, annual reports, or did they have EPDs or LCAs or product carbon footprints available. For the ones we couldn't find that were publicly available, we developed a standard data gathering template that we then emailed to our suppliers to get the data we needed. And as part of that approach, we also made sure that we obtained evidence in return to have on file of EPDs or PCFs or LCAs that they then used. By doing this work, in the last year, we've been able to double the amount of supply emission factors we've received from the previous year, which is when we started doing this, to really improve the accuracy of our emissions. And this is a testament to the incredible efforts made by our procurement team to get us to this point. And then lastly, data improvements. What I'm talking about here is really creating efficiencies in our data collection and reporting processes. So working with ThinkStep, we looked at embedding a bunch of data analytics and completeness checks into our data collection templates, which is essentially an Excel spreadsheet. We asked, as part of the reporting data collection processes, we made sure that if there were movements in volumes, for example, on some of our raw materials, which met a certain threshold, so if it was above or below a certain threshold, that our procurement team members would provide an explanation as to why it moved up or down. And similarly, from a completeness point of view as well, we built in some checks into our Excel template to ensure that if there were new raw materials that were identified in those templates, our procurement teams were able to provide an explanation as to why. It could be because we moved away from one supplier, or it could have been a new contract, but the template was set up in a way to pick up these kind of complete additions to the data that wasn't there from the prior year. And from a supplier emission factor point of view, as I mentioned, in the last 2 years, we've made a lot of headway to get more detail, which meant that we also needed to update our data template to account for all that granular detail. So it wasn't just an extra column that we added just to include the emission factors, but we looked at documenting things like, what life cycle stage that emission factor related to. Is it cradle to gate or cradle to grave? Did this information come from a website, a sustainability report, EPD, and so on and so forth? And then lastly, we have been working with ThinkStep to look at opportunities to streamline the data submission process as well, to reduce any extra impost on the corporate team from an admin point of view, to go back and forth on incomplete spreadsheets. So this is really a work in progress for us. And every year we look at improving these processes as we go forward. So just to kind of finish up on, in terms of what's coming up next, those of you based in Australia will be quite familiar with the mandatory reporting requirements that are coming for BlueScope. Reporting on Scope 3 is mandatory from FY26 because we have a 30th June financial year end, and getting assurance is mandatory from FY27. So we're preparing for this. So we're looking at those continuous improvements in our reporting, which I spoke to just a moment ago. In terms of documentation, ThinkStep already prepares a methodology report or a basis of preparation for us as part of the work they do with us that document the calculation assumptions, methodology that's used. But we're looking to bolster that up a bit more on our end from a kind of a documentation point of view. And then from an external point of assurance point of view, We currently don't get our Scope 3 numbers assured, so we're looking at what that timeline looks for us and what we need to put in place to be able to kind of meet those mandatory timelines. And then continuous improvements on the accuracy of our data. That's just an ongoing pursuit to expand the coverage of our supplier emission factors to increase our accuracy, and looking at any other underlying assumptions we want to revise as well. And finally, continuous engagement is really important. Find allies in your procurement and sales teams. We've been incredibly lucky to have a lot of buy-in and support from our procurement team to date, without whom we won't be able to be where we are. So yeah, from our experience, invest time in educating those teams that you work with, your key data owners and stakeholders, on the importance of Scope 3, because essentially this is not their day job. So it's really important to build incentives as to why it's important for your organization, and that will help ensure better results. So I'll just conclude by saying there's a lot of things you could do to improve your Scope 3 reporting, but just start with materiality. Look at what's important to your organization and who your key stakeholders are to help move the dial. And yeah, take it from there. Thanks, Katrina.
Thank you, Devinka. And I think you anticipated questions quite well, because there were quite some questions coming in. Most of them you have already answered while going through. So that is great. Maybe one question, maybe you can add a little bit to it, is how did you assess the quality and credibility of your supplier emission factors to then be comfortable kind of using them, I assume?
That's a good question. And I think you can probably talk to your side of the equation too, Katrina, because we worked with you. So if it came from credible sources like a published EPD or an LCA or product carbon footprint, which is already verified by a third party, we would consider that to be more credible than perhaps, finding something that's available online without much context around what it includes. The emission boundary is really important for reporting. And then we also did some internal spot checks at the corporate team level on that data, given that we have that kind of climate sustainability knowledge. And then the third layer of defense, I guess, was you guys in ThinkStep, who also reviewed some of that. Maybe you can comment on that a bit more, Katrina.
Yeah, and I think what you said, that kind of the internal training helped quite a lot, so that the people from the procurement team already had some understanding of if they got an emission factor back and it was just a number and email to really follow up, where does it actually come from, or if an EPD came through, is it actually for the particular product they're getting? So there was a lot of backwards and forwards, I think, for you guys internally to what then came from us. And then we did some spot checks as well, really checking the methodology that was used underlying, if that was available, and also doing some ballpark checks with existing emission factors and see, do they align? If not, is there an explanation why it is better or worse, so that we can really factor it in there. Maybe one more question for all the others. We will come back to you later on. How do you balance consistency of your methodology year on year versus continuous improvements? I think that adds on where you said that you kind of added things over the years and we improved it. And where do you find a balance in that, or what do you think is kind of more important for you?
Yeah, for us, I think it's really based on materiality. So if you've got, I guess, new raw materials coming in, which are kind of low value. When I say low value, it's a smaller business unit. It doesn't really, change the dial on our total Scope 3 emission number. We will probably, if we were to go back and, sense check things, that wouldn't trigger the dial as much as, a vast supply, new supply coming into the mix and making the volumes would be quite large compared to prior years. So it's really based on materiality. The way the internal checks are set up is also based on material. So we look at the BUs, which ones have the largest contributions, and then within that also which raw materials contribute to Scope 3 the most. For example, we might have large volumes of certain raw materials that we purchase, but they have a very minimal impact on Scope 3 just because of the way it's extracted and processed, versus some which might not have as much of a volume. It could still be quite significant for a Scope 3 perspective. So yeah, it's really materiality based.
And I guess for some of the elements, when you said you added the co-products, it was also in regards of data availability, right? When did you actually have the data available to calculate that one, to see if you can go back with those ones, or just continue really improving that and adding to it? Right. Thank you for joining us. It was great to have you here. Thank you.
We have many more webinar replays on a whole host of sustainability topics. You can check them out on our website and our YouTube channel.